Good morning, good morning, good morning. We are going to be having our Q&A session this morning with Dr. Denninger, and I am so excited. Let's get everybody on our screen all visible. Good morning, everybody. We'll have everybody's video. Gonna be great. Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Oh my gosh, a new background.
Yeah,
How exciting. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm well. We just had an excellent class, and I'm here to tell you we talked a little bit about decomposers, and we even had an example with a porcini mushroom, which I know we'll get to in a little bit. But
Okay.
before we do, I wanted to mention to everybody that this is Dr. Bryn Dettinger, who is part of our mycology department. And if anybody has any questions about decomposers or fungi or mushrooms, that they should press the ask a question button underneath this video, and we'll answer your question here on the stream, which would be really cool. If you're on Facebook Live, you can go ahead and leave us a comment and we'll try and answer your question there too. So let's get into it. I guess really before we get too far into it, we should talk about what mycology even is.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a joke we like to tell us mycologists that says mycology is better than yours. Mycology. Myco refers to fungi. So mycology is the study of fungi.
So what is a fungi?
Fungi. So it's a whole kingdom of organisms, just like animals are a kingdom and plants are a kingdom. Fungi are their own kingdom. So it's just a whole group of organisms that number maybe 5 million species in the world. We don't really know.
That's so many.
It's a lot.
That's an inconceivable number, and a noble number, it feels
We
like.
only know about 100,000 of them. So the vast majority are out there around us and we don't even know what they are.
That's fascinating. Do you have okay, well, how about this? So I know you're the curator of our mycology collection. So you're the curator of our fungi collection. What is that like? Or what does a fungi collection even look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. They can look differently depending on the type of fungus that's being preserved. Our collection is focused on larger fungi, that what we like to call the macrofungi. And those tend to be preserved in a similar way to plant specimens. So the mushroom or whatever the fungus is will get dried out. And by drying it, we're preserving it. So it keeps things like arthropods or molds, it keeps them from growing on them because they need moisture. So if we can keep it dry, then we can keep all those pests away from them. And then they get stored in boxes. In some places, they store them on herbarium sheets, which is how a plant specimen would be made. You tape it down or glue it down to an herbarium sheet, just a sheet of paper. Sometimes the fungi have been treated that way in the past, particularly when they were thought to actually be plants and not their own distinct lineage. Today, we try to retain the three-dimensional structure of the mushroom itself. Even though that changes, it gets transformed when it's dried down, we still try to preserve that structure as much as possible. And so we put them in small little boxes, and then those get stored in cabinets.
I'm thinking of like all the times I've been to the grocery store and I've seen like dried mushrooms. And I've always wondered how those like worked or kept free from like bugs and stuff. And now I know.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have a favorite thing? Do you have a favorite or like weirdest thing in the collection?
It's hard to say. I think most people would think that the cordyceps fungi are probably the weirdest and coolest thing. So these are fungi that are obligate parasites of arthropods, particularly insects. And we have some that are found on ants and wasps and shield bugs in the collection. So these are, the specimen itself is the fungus and its host. So we'll have, an insect with the fungus growing out of it in a box in our collection. So that's probably what most people would think is the most interesting or has the most wow factor.
Yeah, I have always been fascinated by cordyceps. For our students who might not know, parasitism is like when something is well, Doc, why don't you help explain?
No, you're fine. So it's
You
just
can handle
when
this.
one organism has to live off of another living organism. So it has to keep that host, the living organism, alive so that it can extract its energy from it.
But for parasitism, it's usually for that host, it's usually like not great, right? I think of ticks when I think of parasites and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Generally, parasites have a negative impact on the health of its host. So it could reduce its health. It could, like, compared to one that doesn't have the parasite, you might not do as well. You might not live as long, or you might not be able to get as many resources as the one without parasites. So yeah, parasites are generally considered to be a burden on the host.
That's a pretty complicated relationship, I would imagine, for animals and plants to have to one another. I know that typically when we find mushrooms, we find them like at the base of trees and things like that.
Mm.
So like, why are they always, are they doing something like that to like, are they parasitizing a tree in some way or something like that?
Some do that, yeah. The best known around here probably is armillaria, the honey mushroom. And this is a major pest for the forestry industry. And that's because they actually are part of our coniferous forest landscapes here in the West, although most people don't recognize it. A lot of there are zones of tree senescence throughout the forest where the trees are dead and they'll die from a central point out. And that is because the fungus is growing outwards from a central point and it's eating those trees as it goes. And they
Oh,
can live for hundreds or thousands of years and cover very large areas. In fact, the largest organism that we know about that has ever existed on Earth is one of these honey mushrooms. And it covers over 3 square miles in Oregon, Eastern Oregon. So not too far from here.
whoa, that's a huge space. Wow. And it's all connected in its, do mushrooms have roots?
No, they don't have roots. So mushrooms are the fruiting structures of the fungus. The fungus itself is filamentous. So they look like hair, tiny hair, much smaller than our hair, but they're long single threads that will extend through the soil or whatever the substrate is that they live in. Sometimes they live in other things like trees or animals. But those filaments will spread outward and they can live indefinitely. Provided appropriate resources and in the right kind of environmental conditions, a fungus can grow forever and ever, as far as we know. They don't seem to have the same sort of lifespans that we do. And so these honey mushrooms, the world's largest, we think what's happened is it had an original origin at one central point and then has just grown out over the last 1,000 or 2,000 years from that central point to cover this large area. Now, whether or not it is all connected in between, we don't know. All we can say is it looks genetically from the samples that we've taken on the perimeter and on the inside that they all recognize each other as self. But we don't know if what's happened is all those filaments may have been broken up and fragmented, and they just will still recognize each other and come back together when they meet. We don't know if that's the case.
That's pretty fascinating. Well, so I guess I should ask a follow-up question. When you say that they'll recognize each other as like the same structure, mushrooms, I admit I don't know a lot about mushrooms. I don't want to assume. Mushrooms can like mushrooms communicate with one another?
Well, they do. So so it's not the mushrooms that will do it, but it's the filaments in the soil.
Okay.
So when they come into contact with each other, yeah, they have these signaling molecules, and they will determine if that thing is the same or different. And if it's different, it'll defend itself from it or even try to attack it. And we know that like if you were to go and cut open wood, like downed wood, like a log, and look out the end, you'd probably see black lines separating the different individual fungi within the log. And they put up
Oh,
these barriers these thickened melanized cells, which are the black lines that you see, which is basically like a wall to keep the other individual from invading on its territory. So they're
Cool.
battles, they're fungal battle zones. Yeah,
Fungal fighting words, huh?
yeah.
Well, I can see that we're starting to get some questions in from some of our viewers. If you have a question, please feel free to press the ask a question button or leave us a comment on Facebook because we'd love to see it. Don't be shy. So the first feels like a really important question. Amy from Salt Lake City asks, how do fungi help the environment?
Well, our environment depends on fungi entirely for its persistence. So they help in many different ways. Two of the ways that they help are as decomposers. So they are the primary decomposers of all organic material in the world, particularly in terrestrial ecosystems, but probably also in aquatic, including marine ecosystems. So they are the first line of decomposition in that recycling process. And without the decomposition, all of the nutrients that get locked up by animals and plants would no longer be available to future generations of animals and plants and other organisms. And so the fungi play a very critical role in releasing those nutrients back so that future generations can utilize them.
So I'm thinking of the activities that we did today, and some of our students might recognize some of this as well, but we talked a little bit about the trophic levels and the food web and such. And so I guess what I'm imagining is, since this is the first, like, this breaks it down, makes the ecosystem really healthy, it breaks down and makes all these nutrients available, that if we didn't have the decomposers, like the mushrooms and things like that, would we have a lot of just accumulated dead stuff around?
Yeah, we simply wouldn't exist because it wouldn't take long for the dead stuff to accumulate to the point where nothing could live anymore.
Ew, gross. So, well, thank you, mushrooms are
Yeah.
unsung heroes. That leads us to an excellent question from Victoria from Texas, who asks, what is your favorite mushroom or fungi?
Well, I am partial to a group of mushrooms called porcini, which you already mentioned at the intro. It's a group that I've loved for over a decade now. They're really good to eat. They're one of the most widely traded, wild collected edible mushrooms in the world. And I emphasize wild collected, and that's because unlike the mushrooms you buy at the grocery store, they can't be cultivated. And that's because they are symbiotic. They're mutualistic with plants. They have to grow with the plant or you can't grow them at all. And so they have to be collected from the wild for that reason, much like truffles.
Cool. Are they like a big mushroom or a little mushroom?
They're big generally. They can be really big. I've seen specimens. I have not personally witnessed this, but I've seen photos of specimens that weigh over 5 pounds. A single mushroom that weighs over 5 pounds.
That's
So
enormous.
that would feed an army, a small army.
That is almost a baby. That's enormous.
Yeah, they're big.
Well, I guess this is a good time to ask, like, what is up with the mushrooms behind you?
Oh yeah. Well, so it's springtime here in North America, and this is the time where you see this particular group of mushrooms come out. And they're only here for a couple of weeks every year. And these are the morels. So there's a number of species in North America. They're found all over the world. But these you can find right here in Utah right now. They're just coming out in the valley and moving upwards as the temperatures warm. And they're considered a delicacy. So they haven't been cultivated with a great deal of commercial success, although people have recently cracked the code on this one. And they're now being cultivated at large scales, but still not something you'd find in the grocery store very easily or very frequently. So these are kind of exciting to find. They're really fun to go find because it's early in the year. There's not much else around, and they look really quite remarkable. They're like honeycombs on stalks.
Yeah, the pattern is super cool.
Yeah.
If somebody wanted to go out and look for those kinds of things, like, how would they do any of that? I know that there are some mushrooms that are very poisonous to people. And so, like, how do you do any of that or investigate any of that safely?
I would contact your local mushroom club. And there are mushroom clubs all over the country, all over North America and beyond. And those are the people that will have the best resource for that kind of stuff. I should point out morels, there are false morels, and some of those are quite poisonous. In fact, people have died from eating some false morels.
Oh no.
So you should definitely check with an expert before you dig in. Also, morels can make people sick.
So it sounds like the thing to do is before you put anything in your mouth, check with a grown-up, or at least a grown-up who knows a lot about mushrooms in the Mushroom Society. It's probably who you should check with
Absolutely.
first.
Yeah, I think any wild collected food, you should consult an expert first, whether it's a mushroom or a berry.
And can you, Bill from Facebook is wondering like if we can find these morels around Salt Lake City and in the Wasatch.
Yes, you can. So in Salt Lake City, there's a couple of species that grow in riparian zones. So they like cottonwoods down near rivers and streams, or elms, particularly dead trees, like recently died. They also occur spontaneously in wood chips sometimes, bark, I should say. So if you know of a place that's recently had landscaping done with bark, you might want to check that out, because that occurs regularly, and it usually is only around for 1 year on the bark.
But you want to be careful of like, I think about when it comes to like urban foraging and things like that, also being mindful of like the pesticides maybe people are using, like if someone's doing
Sure.
landscaping, being thoughtful of the like pesticides and stuff. Like we said, be careful of the kinds of like weird random stuff that you put in your mouth. Check with a grown up.
And fungi tend to accumulate heavy metals.
Oh yeah.
So anything that's near a roadside is not something you'd ever want to eat, because it's likely to pick up lead from car exhaust.
Gross. Yuck. We have a few more questions from Facebook. Some of them go together really well. Montana from Utah asks, what are some differences between fungi and plants? That's a great question, Montana.
Yeah, so the biggest difference is that plants can make their own food. Their photosynthesis converts sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugar, and fungi don't have that ability. So we call, in scientific terms, we call the plants, we call those autotrophs, auto being self food, and fungi are heterotrophs like you and I. We have to consume things from outside of our bodies to get the energy we need. Fungi are the same way. So that's a big difference between plants and fungi. They do have some similarities, but they're sort of superficial similarities. The first similarity is that they're sedentary. They can't walk around, right? Like animals can. And for that reason alone, fungi were classified as plants for many years.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, there's a long list here that it might take too long to get through all of it. So if we want to continue.
I think of the things that sometimes when scientists first look at something, we jump to a lot of conclusions when really we need to do a lot of deeper observing before we can get to the truth. Like how coral isn't a plant, it's an animal, right? But we have to study it up close.
Yeah.
Like these are not plants, they are fungi. We just have to study them up close.
Yeah, science is a cumulative process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Ava from Salt Lake City has two questions. First, how do mushrooms and fungi digest the dead animals?
Yeah, so they excrete enzymes outside of their cells. So they're sort of like inverted stomachs. So if you were to think of your stomach has enzymes inside of it to digest the food that you consume, if you were to take your stomach and unfold it, so the enzymes were on the outside, that's kind of like what a fungus is.
Okay.
So they're spitting their enzymes outside of themselves. The enzymes then work in the environment, whatever that is, a dead animal or a dead plant or soil. Those enzymes convert the molecules in that dead animal or whatever it is, and breaks them down into smaller units, so that the fungus can then reabsorb the smaller units into its cells and use those for energy. So that's generally how it works.
about breaking animals and plants down to like molecule levels, and that takes quite some time, but it's not
Yeah.
quite, I guess it's not quite the same thing as like the way we imagine other things breaking stuff down by like bugs, like a ground beetle might eat at like some carrion or something like that, a dead animal or something like that. A
Yeah.
little different because
There,
mushrooms don't have mouths.
no, but there is they do have some mechanical activity as well. So the filaments of the cells can penetrate through, and that provides that sort of fracturing of larger tissues or whatever it is into smaller spaces. So there is some mechanical
Okay.
analogy to chewing, but not quite at the same scale.
Sure, sure. Ava has another question, and we touched a little bit on it briefly. She asks, are truffles a type of fungi, and why are they so expensive?
They are a type of fungus. Truffles are actually related to morels. So I called these mushrooms, but they're not technically mushrooms. So they're in a completely different group of fungi from the rest of the mushrooms. But they all produce these macroscopic sporulating structures. So what that means is they make their spores, which is how they reproduce, in these large structures, which looks like a mushroom. So they're related to morels, and but instead of being above ground, their structures are entirely below ground. So you can imagine this being below ground. It would look different. It would look enclosed because there's no point in having your spores exposed if you're just in soil. So the strategy with the truffle is that they get their spores moved around by attracting an animal to them, so that the animal digs them up and eats them, and then the animal moves around and then deposits the spores from its other end somewhere else. Whereas morels rely primarily on wind for spore dispersal, and that's why they're above ground. Now, why are they so expensive? Well, a couple of reasons. One, they're really hard to find. They only occur in a small period of time. And they have some really peculiar aromas that are highly prized. So some people find them really delicious, and they're rare, and so that's why they're so expensive.
Yeah, so I've always heard of them being dug up with like dogs and pigs and things like that. Have
Yeah,
you
that's
ever?
true.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
so cool. I wonder if they have like little like no eat truffle masks on some of them.
Well, so the pigs are naturally attracted to them, and that's because they produce chemicals that mimic pig pheromones, sex pheromones. So the pigs
Oh,
just
okay.
naturally seek them out. They probably exploited wild pigs originally. But dogs can be trained, and the advantage of the dog is you can train the dog not to eat the truffle, whereas the pigs, you can't train them not to eat the truffle.
I used to be a zookeeper, and I've trained quite a few animals to do things, husbandry behaviors and things like that. But I still have like a pet dog at home, and the idea of like get that out of your mouth is that would be a lot to handle, especially if you had a very expensive truffle with you.
Yeah.
Um, let's see, we have a few more questions. Mark from Florida asks, this dovetails nicely. I know you mentioned that truffles are very fancy and rare to find, but for less rare ones, what wild animals eat fungi or mushrooms? Maybe particularly here in Utah.
Well, we're still learning how many different kinds of animals eat fungi. It turns out that a lot of them do. We have a project in my lab actually that's looking at fungi that are being consumed by small mammals. So we're working with the curator of mammals at the museum, and he is sampling the feces of specimens that he collects, and then we look in the feces for fungal DNA. And from that, we can infer what the animal has consumed. And so we're learning for the first time that some small mammals are eating fungi that we didn't know they were doing before now. But we know deer will eat mushrooms, squirrels frequently consume mushrooms, bears probably eat mushrooms. There's probably very few things that won't eat a mushroom under the right circumstances. But in addition to vertebrates, we also know that there are a lot of invertebrates that consume mushrooms. Particularly, there's a lot of flies will lay their eggs on an inside of mushrooms, and then their larvae will consume the mushroom during early development.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so many, if not most, wild mushrooms that you collect, if you open it up, you'll see that they have fly larvae inside of them.
Maybe don't eat those.
Well, it's up to you. They don't bother most people that collect wild mushrooms. They're pretty used to it. So there's ways you can get rid of them if you're squeamish.
Fair. You actually used one of my favorite science words of all time. And so I'd like to use it as an opportunity for us to talk about some of the science that you are doing. You were saying that you inferred, and for our students who are tuning in, they might know that an inference is a guess. It's our best guess that scientists make based on evidence that they've been able to observe. And so when you're observing the mushroom DNA in the poop of small animals. What sort of things you said you have kind of can you share with us some of the inferences you have made from your research?
From that particular project?
Sure.
Yeah, so there's actually a truffle that's not related to these. It's a different kind of truffle, but it lives below ground and relies on animals to dig it up and eat it to move around. And that genus is called Rhizopogon. And it turns out that the majority of the fungi that most of the small animals that we've looked at belong to this genus Rhizopogon. And we don't know yet how many species of Rhizopogon we've been able to document, but certainly over a dozen species. And what's interesting for us is that many of these have never been recorded for Utah, or even in the whole Intermountain West region at all. In fact, some of these species that we're uncovering, there are only 2 records of them in collections worldwide. And so it's quite amazing that we can utilize small mammals as proxies for fungal distributions and occurrences. And that's what we're doing with this project. So we're not so good at finding truffles because they're below ground, and we don't have the sense of smell developed as well as, say, a squirrel. But we can use a squirrel to find these things for us, and that's kind of what we're doing here.
Cool. Let's see. Oh, here's a really big important one. We have just a few more minutes left, and I would like to ask, like, if you were a middle schooler or a high schooler who is like hyped for morels and porcini and things, what would you recommend that they do if they want to get involved?
Well, again, I would recommend that they seek out their local mushroom club. So there's going to be a non-professional society nearby. It may not be in your particular area, but say, for example, in Utah, the Mushroom Society of Utah would be a great resource. And they have a website, and they have people you can contact, and sometimes they'll have meetings where you can go and learn mushroom identification, ways to tell apart poisonous ones from edible ones. So that's really the best resource. There, of course, are also field guides available, books that you can get to start to familiarize yourself with the kinds of features that you observe when you're identifying a fungus. This is how I started. I was actually self-taught using the National Audubon Society Field Guide to Mushrooms. That's where I started. And I think that's a good place for students to start, because there's a whole language of mycology that is probably unfamiliar to most people. And if you start with a resource like that, you can start to learn that language so that when you go to your amateur club to learn more, you'll already be prepared for using and understanding some of the terms.
Sure. Just like how in school we would regularly have vocabulary words that we might use next week kind of thing. You should get your vocabulary words in order before you go to your fun mushroom meeting.
Yeah, you'll get more out of it.
Yeah. And it's just like regular learning. And also I love reading field guides because they're just a lot of fun to look at the pictures sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, friends. Well, that is about all the time we have for today. Dr. Dettinger, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for answering all of our questions. And friends, we will see you back here tomorrow at 9:30 Mountain Daylight Time for this second part of our class today. We're going to be finishing up with our research assistant notebook, and we're going to be figuring out the rest of our investigations. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dettinger. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Bye, my friend.
Bye.